then finally, my name is James. I'm your host, and I'm the associate partner of Brainbox for the Sourcing as a Service division. So now I'm going to hand over to Joel, who will do a quick introduction as our guest and the panelist today. So Joel, over to you.
Thanks, James, and thanks for having me. Really appreciate it. So yeah, just happy to be here this morning. Just to give you a bit of background on myself. So I'm based in Montreal, Canada. I spent 10 years at 7 years, maybe felt like 10 years, but 7 years at IBM. And at the end there, I was leading the source to pay practice as well. So a role similar to James's role right now. Left about 2 years ago when my first child came along and set up Pure Procurement. So if you've been following me at all on the social networks, you'll know that it's a lot about thought leadership in the procurement space and more procurement application space, so source to pay, and have been doing mandates through that in that format ever since. And over the course of my career, I've been involved in 12 different procurement technology implementations in the whole life cycle, right? So from spend analysis and sourcing to contract management to procure to pay and invoicing and accounts payable, supplier data management, supplier evaluations, that sort of thing, business networks as well for transactional purchasing. So I've kind of played in the source to pay sandbox my entire career. And you know, as a fun fact, just became a dad for the second time. So I'm on paternity leave right now, but when James asked me to chat, I can't say no to James. So here I
am. You're a gentleman, and you also look remarkably refreshed and awake, considering you've got a 3-week-old baby. So I don't know how you do it. You must have good face cream. So yeah. I think we're going to have a good discussion, Joel, because obviously my background is very different in that I'm a sourcing procurement guy from background. I spent 17 years in the automotive and FMCG industries in the UK, and then later in Germany, and also spent a little bit of time in Nigeria and South Africa as well. So my background really is more on the practical side as a practitioner in various procurement and category management and procurement leadership roles in manufacturing industry. So with someone with a pure consulting background and someone with a more practitioner background together, I think will be a very good mix to sort of approach this topic. Just a few words about who Brainbox are and what we do before we jump right in. Brainbox Consulting is based in Eindhoven in the Netherlands, and focus areas traditionally have been on SAP Ariba, and especially source to pay implementation and doing technology implementations for some pretty big companies predominantly in Europe. And one of the things that we are now branching into is offering sourcing as a service as kind of a natural expansion into the procurement space, from what was traditionally an IT consultancy. So essentially, if you want to outsource your sourcing events to us, or if you're an organization that doesn't have the budget to purchase an e-sourcing software like SAP Ariba or a competitor product for that matter, we can run the events for you using our license and on our platform, and we can be as hands-on or hands-off as you want us to be, essentially. So we can do anything from a complete done-for-you end-to-end service, right the way through to a more traditional BPO model where we just manage it for you and then hand it back for you guys to do the negotiations and the contracting with your suppliers. But this isn't a sales pitch. We're actually going to have a proper discussion. So the first thing that I wanted to ask you, Joel, is when you go about looking for a consultant, the most important thing, or one of the most important things, is actually knowing what you're seeking. So how do you establish then whether a consultant could be a trusted partner? What would you typically need to look for, or what discussions would need to be had with other stakeholders within the business to be able to ascertain what sort of provider is the best fit for what you're looking to do?
Sure. And I think what's important at the outset is to define terms, right? So You said trusted partner, and for me, that really is a function of consulting. And so consulting is really bringing in expertise that you don't necessarily have at the table, versus subcontracting, right? So bringing in a pair of extra hands to help you achieve something, right? So I make that distinction between consulting and subcontracting. And I think to your point, when you're going and trying to find a trusted partner or trying to find someone in consulting to help you, you're essentially buying two things, right? You're buying a person, and you're buying assets that come along with that person as well. And the combination of that, the assets, the methodology, the approach, and the experience of that person, their approach, their soft skills and hard skills is what you're bringing to the table. And I think we need to highlight that term that you put on the slide there, trust, right? So trust is the number one thing that you need to have in that relationship. So if you haven't built trust with the consultant that's coming in or with the team that's coming in, then to me it's not a good sign. It doesn't necessarily mean you won't be able to during the mandate, but it's someone that you want to be able to trust, because you're going to be asking them questions around tough decisions that you need to take, strategic decisions that you need to take going forward.
So how would you establish? Sorry, if I may jump in there.
Absolutely.
How would you establish that? I mean, a lot of consulting relationships, especially in big companies, tend to come from prior connections, within the upper echelons of the organization, who have maybe worked with senior partners in consulting firms in their past work history. But if you're approaching this from a clean slate, and you're looking to do an RFP, what would generally point you in the direction of whether you should be looking at one of the big boys versus a more boutique player?
So I think it comes back to what you're saying, what you're trying to accomplish as well, right? So the size of the project will definitely have something to do with it. So, we're talking more in the focus of procurement, but say it's a global business transformation and you're ripping out an ERP and you're putting in a new one, then you might be better served by a larger firm that has more capacity, broad capacity over all of the different functional areas that you'll have within your scope, right? Whereas a boutique consulting firm typically, I should say, will have more of a specific area of expertise. And so, it really depends on the size and scope of the project, what you're trying to accomplish, and building that trust should be done during that RFP process, or that the sourcing process as a whole, say, because RFP could just be one piece, but taking the time to build relationships with the different providers that you're looking to potentially engage, to build those relationships, right? To take the time to have dinners with them, or typically we'll see just oral presentations, and I find, like, a written piece and an oral presentation, I find that isn't necessarily going to give you the amount of face time that you need with the different consulting firms to establish a relationship, establish a soft feeling of whether or not you're going to be able to work with these guys days on end, right? Because these types of projects, yes, you'll have a plan, yes, you'll have a methodology, but inevitably you're going to hit some road bumps along the way. And so you want to be able to sit down at the table with folks that will help you work through the issue, and will be collaborative in getting through issues and speed bumps and risks, and mitigate those with you, instead of having an adversarial relationship.
That's great. Okay, so I'm just going to go back to the screen share, and there we go. So there are different types of procurement services provision. And let's just spend a couple of minutes walking through these to give anyone that's maybe watching or listening to this a bit of clarity around the different types of consultancy or procurement services provision that are out there, because it's highly dependent on what it is that you want to accomplish, and also the size of your business, as you touched upon already. But at the top end, you've got the strategic consultancies, which, thinking of the big names, are typically the likes of McKinsey and BCG. Then you've got the operational consultancies. IBM, I guess, is one of them, although they do pretty much everything because they're so big. Also Accenture, Capita in the UK. They are an operational consultant. as opposed to a strategic consultant, would be the ones that actually do the ongoing implementation of findings that have been presented, or project work that needs to be implemented, usually as sort of a one-off project, as opposed to, you know, a consultant that's going to be part of your business, intertwined with your business on an ongoing basis. And then moving on to 3, business process outsourcing. That is, you know, exactly that. That is when an external service provider becomes an integral part of your business. And that can be, for example, what we at Brainbox do with sourcing as a service, or it can be an outsourced team that does, for example, operational procurement or accounts payable, or it can even be someone that does a niche specialist service on your behalf on an ongoing basis, like marketing procurement or travel procurement, or something that is quite specialist. Then you've got niche category and process expertise, and Joelle, I guess your consultancy sort of fits into that one, doesn't it? And that you're you only look at source to pay, and that's the niche that that's the niche or the sandbox that you play in. And because, you know, you're a small business and you can't be all things to all people, you focus on that specific niche and work with a specific subset of clients.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think number 5 as well kind of fits into what I do, right? Because I'm a one-man band, as it were. But I think what's important as well is that you know, not all firms will fit nicely into one category. So it's great that you're listing them out, but at the same time, you need to think that, as you mentioned, like an IBM or an Accenture will do strategy, they'll do operations, they'll do the whole life cycle, right? They'll even finance the project for you if need be. As you go into different relationships with consulting firms, you want to get an idea of where they play along this continuum and in these different categories.
Right, and then at the very bottom, you've got, you know, the classic, most cost-effective model usually, which is, you know, bringing in an independent contractor or an interim manager to just deliver a specific project or to fill in a specific gap that you may have in your team. If someone's on long-term sick leave or is on maternity leave, or there's a specific project that needs to be delivered over a fixed period of time, and you just need someone to come in and essentially report into the existing organization. So from top to bottom, that really is, you know, also broadly speaking, when we look at price, generally 1 and 2 are going to be sort of at the higher end. And as you go down, based on the size of the businesses, typically, not always, but typically, from a cost perspective, number 1 is going to be the highest cost, and number 6 is generally going to be the lower cost option, based on size of business and overhead that they're carrying, and the different levels of work that they do.
Sure. And it's important to know this up front, because you don't want to unwittingly, like, continuity is nice as well during a transformation or a big program, right? So if you're going and hiring a strategic consulting firm and that's all that they do, and they do a bunch of the work up front to help you define the strategy, but there's no knowledge transfer, or you're not aware that they're not going to be able to stay on to actually implement the strategy, then, you know, it can throw a wrench in the plans quite quickly, right? So you want to make sure that even though you might be contracting out only a small portion of your project or program at the beginning, that you're having that overall vision in terms of who's going to be your partner and who's going to accompany you and give you that advice and that additional brain power throughout your program.
And yeah, I mean, if you're looking for someone to actually come in and do the implementation based on the recommendations that a strategic consultancy has made, and you don't have the resources or the expertise in-house to do that, I mean, I guess most bigger organizations have the expertise, but often they don't have the resources. Then, you know, bringing in another consultancy to then come in and implement it is kind of a risky business, isn't it? Because you've got one consultancy's work or IP or thought leadership being implemented by another organization that may, in reality, just want to tear it all up and start from scratch because they don't agree with the findings.
Yeah, and I mean, but it happens a lot if we're
Yeah.
honest. So I think the key there is making sure that you're mitigating those risks in terms of the handoff. So making sure that there's time for knowledge transfer, making sure that everybody is at the table during that critical phase where you're handing off from strategy to implementation, and you know, rubber hitting the road, so that the intentions are understood, and that, you know, you're bringing in, if you're bringing on an operational or an implementation partner, that they share your vision, right? To address that point that you're saying, you don't want to rip it up. You don't want to necessarily be able to say, you know, as they say so often in politics, oh, the last administration gave us X, Y, and Z, right? So making part of the sourcing process the onboarding process as well, so that when you actually hit the road, rubber hits the road, you're everybody's on the same page, right? And there's none of this bickering over he said, she said.
Yeah, and there can also be a good business case there to say that if you've got a report from strategic consultants that suggests doing certain different pieces of work, it may be a better strategy to bring in BPO or niche category or solopreneur consultants, so numbers 3, 4, and 5, to do specific aspects of that. And again, I use our examples as Brainbox to do some strategic sourcing and to do some sourcing events online on behalf of the client. Or if a new source to pay system is being recommended, then bringing in someone like yourself to do the due diligence and manage the implementation of that. Because bringing in another big organization that's going to do the operational implementation, they will almost certainly have their own operating procedures and ways of working that may be very different to the other consultancy that's just done the thought leadership piece. So yeah,
absolutely.
So the next one, and this is maybe an obvious one, but the size of the business and the budget, and also based on the amount of bandwidth within your organization, within your procurement team, and how much handholding and how much guidance you're able to give your consultancy provider, is also going to impact on not only the level of service, but on top of that, the type of consultancy that is likely going to be the best fit with you. So, I mean, maybe you can talk us through a couple of examples there, Joel, where you've specifically gone in and done some work where using someone that's small and agile like yourself has benefited, and likewise maybe the flip side, going back into your corporate career when an organization has really benefited from having the depth of someone like IBM.
Yeah, sure. And I think it goes back a little bit to the scope of the project that you're doing. So if it's a huge project, you're going to want a methodology and assets that are going to point you in a certain direction and really bring everybody in that direction as quickly as possible, right? So if you're trying to steer a big ship, then those types of approaches will most likely yield the best results. And that's where, an IBM, an Accenture, a Deloitte, et cetera, will have an edge over smaller players. However, on the flip side, if you're trying to do, something more tailored, something more specific, then a smaller consultancy will still have assets, right? Depending on the side, right? I'm sure Brainbox has a number of assets that are more tailored to a specific solution. So you're mentioning SAP Ariba at the outset, for example. So it'll be something that's much more specific, process specific, but also potentially application specific, which will give you a much deeper knowledge of expertise and value, right? So the big models, the big approaches in the big firms are kind of a fit all model. It's not always the case, right? Like I want to be cognizant of the fact that, even within big firms, you might have smaller practices that act as a proxy to smaller consulting firms. But generally, the bigger the project, the bigger the team that you're bringing on, the more generic the methodology is going to be. Whereas the smaller the project, the smaller the team, and the smaller the firm, the more tailored, the more customized your approach can be. That being said, as you're going through the setup and the onboarding of the process, right? If a firm, whether it be a big or a small firm, brings in their methodology and their assets, you might have certain methodologies and assets internally that are very important to you, that they be in a specific format or that they be done a specific way, right? So really taking the time to marry those two methodologies and making sure that from a deliverables perspective and from an approach perspective, both organizations are aligned going in. Everybody will do that with you and should do that with you at the outset of the project to ensure that you get what you need and what you want from the initiative at the end. And just to address your last point around the pricing, I think you nailed it on the head, right? The bigger the firm and the bigger the brand name, the more you're likely going to pay. I think there are exceptions to that, right? If you're helping a big firm build a new practice as an anchor client, then you might be able to get better rates. Or if you're working on bleeding edge technology that they're having trouble selling on the market because it's very proof of concept like, then you're probably going to be able to negotiate prices a little lower. But general rule of thumb, the bigger the firm, the bigger the price. And on the flip side, it might not always be the case for smaller consulting firms, right? So solo consultants or small firms with a very pointed niche expertise that's very in demand will also potentially have a higher price point. So I think there's, as a general rule of thumb, I think you nailed it on the head, but you need to consider those exceptions as well and not necessarily be surprised if that's not if you're in the exception to the rule scenario.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Actually, there are boutique consultancies that specialize in very, very high level services like game theory, and they most definitely do charge a premium. So yeah, that's a great point. Okay, so moving on, and I realized that my video has dropped because I had a couple of connection problems. So maybe Bridget or Noel, you can bring me back in. So moving on from that, the next point is, well, do you need niche expertise or help with a specific process or project? Is your requirement very, very defined? Do you have a very specific scope of work, or is it a more strategic approach across the whole business? And I guess my approach here, or what my hypothesis here, is that if you're very, very clear in what you want and it's quite niche and it's quite specialized, and you can nail it down pretty concisely what you want to get, then finding a boutique firm that can deliver that is likely going to be more fruitful than going to one of the big boys that are more generalists, albeit they all have their divisions within that. Whereas if it's a more holistic, complete corporate transformation exercise, then going to a procurement consultancy on their own is going to be quite a futile exercise, I would assume.
Yeah, I think that's a good general rule of thumb. But I think I'd add two things that we mentioned a little earlier as well, which is one is if you know exactly what you need and what you want, then you're more able to go towards the subcontractor route, maybe bring in folks that are just additional pair of hands that have the expertise that you're looking for. Whereas if you don't, on the other end of the continuum, if you don't know what you're looking for and you have a bunch of pain points and you don't know how to resolve them in the best manner possible, whether that be from a business perspective or from an application architecture perspective, then going the consulting route, more consulting route will be better for you in the end. And then on that continuum of trust as well, you're going to need to have more trust in the folks that are giving you recommendations and on things that you have no idea about how to solve, right? Whereas if you know exactly what you want to do, you're going to have less trust needed at the outset of the relationship, because you're going to have a better BS meter, right? To be very, very transparent with you. So you're going to know, within a couple of weeks, whether that person is able to deliver on your vision or not, right? Whereas it'll take a lot more time if you don't know necessarily where things are going, right? So I think that adds two different elements to what you were saying as well.
So what you're saying is, in scenario one, it's a little bit more of a step out into the dark, whereas in scenario two, It's more around managing your consultancy, almost like you would manage contractors if you're very, very clear about what it is that you want them to deliver.
Yeah, and to add another element to that, right? If you're very clear on what you want delivered, then you can go towards a fixed price model. And to address your question on pricing, right? You can know what the exact costs are going to be, and potentially there's clauses in there and assumptions that help build out that model. But you're able to predict costs a lot better than here, where there's a lot of uncertainty and there's a lot of questions and responses and answers that we need to go get throughout the mandate. So firms will probably, react along that continuum in negotiations with you based on the level of uncertainty, right? If there's a lot of uncertainty, don't think you're going to be able to put folks into a fixed price model. Whereas if there is a lot of certainty, then you can drift towards that end of the continuum for sure.
Okay. So moving on to the next one that we had. And this is kind of built into the previous one as well, is how much flexibility and agility do you want in your consultancy or in your service provider? Do you want a standard operating model that the consultant will offer you, especially if you don't really know what you want to get from it, and it's kind of a more all-encompassing transformation? Or do you really want a tailor-made solution to your specific needs? Because that's when, again, just thinking again with using Brainbox as an example, we can be as hands-on or hands-off as the client wants to be, whereas some of the bigger consultancies will generally have an out-of-the-box solution. And yes, there's a degree of flexibility, but it's more their intellectual property being the process that they've designed, as opposed to the client telling the consultant what they want and then the consultant coming back with something that delivers to their needs.
Yeah, and to make an analogy with IT applications, like if you use a big firm for a typical software implementation, for example, you might have flexibility, but it's within a certain range, right? So I liken it to like configuration of a solution, right? So I have to stay within the configuration of my solution. However, with a smaller firm and with solo consultants, I can be much more tailored and do development, right? In terms of, if I liken it to implementation. So if I have specific deliverables that I want done, or I want to have specific activities that are outside the scope of the approach and the methodology, I think smaller firms will be much more agile and flexible and able to do that, because generally they'll have a senior staff that's very knowledgeable, has a lot of experience in their field, and so can be nimble and flexible in that manner. Whereas with the big firm, if you have a bigger team, there's a certain portion at the very top of the team that usually will have good expertise, good experience. And then as you go down through the team and you have juniors on the team, like they have maybe a year, maybe 2 years experience in what you're doing on the project. So it's harder for them to be nimble and quick and go in a direction without making mistakes. They'll stick to that methodology and that approach that they've been trained on.
Yeah, right. And the other thing is as well, in terms of support, I'm thinking more now as a BPO model, but often some of the big providers that provide BPO services, if you have a problem, you have to create a support ticket. Whereas
right.
With what we do, if the client has a problem, they come to me, or they come to Noel. Yes, we would have junior analysts that do a lot of the heavy lifting, but we would not have a ticketing system in some shared service center halfway across the world that deals with any client related questions. And I think that's always a big selling point, to use a boutique consultancy rather than one of the bigger players, that you're almost a number rather than a valued client to some extent.
Oh, for sure. Right. Because, let's just think about the business models, right? One of them is, those big consulting firms are public companies in most cases, or they're for growth companies. So they have growth targets and they have investors, and they're in that whole growth model, right? Where they have to make a big sausage machine for consulting mandates, right? And so if you don't have a support platform or support processes, then it's impossible to scale, to keep scaling, keep growing those already very big businesses, right? Whereas, and you're one of thousands and thousands of clients, right? Whereas with a smaller firm, you're gonna have more leverage, right? I shouldn't be saying that because I'm in that situation, right? But you're gonna have more leverage in the sense that you're gonna be one of fewer customers. You're gonna be one of, you know, the firm is gonna have more invested in the relationship with you. So it's finding that balance, right, of what you need to accomplish, and the firm needs to have those tools and skills to be able to help you accomplish the size and scope of your ambitions. But at the same time, you don't want to be treated like a number, to your point, right? So it's finding that balance. But what I would say is having done 10 years of transformation projects, like every time I approach a new one, my instinct is always to say, how can we make this the smallest scope possible, right? So, you know, a pilot and then rolling out and making sure that you're building a snowball, so that the first thing that you do is the smallest thing possible, and then you push it down and it gathers steam by itself. Because if you have this humongous scope from the start and you're re-engineering the whole procurement function from day one, and before you have an initial go live of a solution, whether it be a business process or an IT solution, that's where you get into trouble.
Yeah, absolutely. So just before we round off, I think that's the last one, yeah. Just before we round off, there are a few other considerations that come into this as well. I mean, we've talked about standard operating model and style versus a tailored solution based on your needs. We did touch on number 2 a little bit, and that is, you know, are you going with people who have practical industry experience, or you know, are you going to have fresh MBA graduates going into your facility or into your organization who, you know, maybe be able to talk a good game and apply a lot of business models and theories, but they just lack the practical experience? And you did touch a bit on that, Joel, but I think it's worth exploring, because yes, the big consultancies will have people that have industry experience, but you know, some of the juniors or the ones that are the day-to-day contacts on the accounts, as you said, oftentimes are the folks that are fresh out of college and don't have as much practical experience. And in the smaller firms, you tend to get people that have come from I hate this word, but if I say the real world as practitioners, who have then moved into consulting as well as career consultants working on an account together.
Yeah. Let's take a minute on that point number 2, because, you know, from my personal story, right, like it would be hypocritical of me to say that fresh MBA graduates will not deliver value, right? Like I don't even have an MBA, and I went into consulting straight out of university. So, you know, what's interesting in that model is that the juniors that you have in a big consulting firm, and potentially in a small consulting firm, there'll just be less of them, right? Is that these people are highly ambitious folks, highly driven. They've probably done, you know, elite sport or elite music, something in their background, and they have a very similar persona in many respects most of the time, right? And then it's cultural fit with the different firms. But I find people will have those juniors will have a similar profile. They're very driven, very knowledgeable. But to your point, right, it's just making sure that as they're going full speed in one direction, they're not heading towards a wall that they haven't seen before. And only experience can give you that over time, right? So I think, you know, you want that good mix. If you have a project with only juniors, then you know things will get done. They'll get done well. They'll get done quickly, but they might be done in the wrong direction, right? So, or you know, you might miss certain opportunities along the way. So that's why it's important to have somebody that has 5-10 years experience in implementing the type of thing that you're trying to implement, right? So it's striking that balance, because if you have 100% senior practitioners on your project, then it's going to be a lot more expensive to get that delivered, right? So I don't think there's I think it's finding that balance, and everybody has their role to play within an implementation like that.
So what you're saying is, in a smaller firm, typically the juniors are a lot closer to the partners and the principals, both in terms of hierarchy and also in terms of, you know, practical face time with them on a specific project.
And they'll most likely be, or have to have a wider skill set earlier on, right? Versus
through necessity,
through necessity and survival, right? Whereas in a bigger firm, you might be able to have a junior that's very good, but in a specific silo, right? Because we have the amount of projects that we need to to get that person occupied all the time. Whereas in a smaller firm, well, they're going to be on, different projects for different processes, and they're going to have to develop expertise that's much wider, much more quickly.
And then agility and hierarchy, again, we touched on that as well, but again, a smaller firm is going to be able to flex and is going to be able to move with the needs of the client a lot quicker and a lot more agile than a bigger firm, simply because they have less bureaucracy. And yes, on the other hand, on the flip side, they may not have consultants that are sitting on the bench, that are between projects like an Accenture or an IBM or a Deloitte would through the sheer nature of their size. But often they can bring in resource at short notice through using a pool of associates and through having sort of freelancers on their books that can come in and sort of hit the ground running, who are highly experienced in their field.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a great point, right? And just to highlight what you're saying around being able to steer the ship or change directions quickly, like I've seen, like big firms will work with you to put together an innovative statement of work model, or to work out specific clauses if you can't make their standard clauses work. But it will take time, right? It needs to go through their legal, and it needs to go through different levels of approvals. Whereas with a smaller firm, as you say, since it's much flatter in terms of the structure, and it's probably much more localized as well in terms of the report to structure, right? So that they could take decisions faster in terms of innovative contracting clauses, for example. So I think that's a big one to take into consideration as well.
Okay, thank you, Joel. So I'm going to skip the fourth one because we're slowly running out of time and want to make sure that we've got time to do the Q&A. So just very, very quickly before we jump on to anyone with any questions, we do offer the opportunity here at Brainbox for you to do a one trial event for us, with us completely risk-free. So if you have a category of spend that you would like to give to us to run a sourcing event with and to test out what we offer as sourcing as a service, we will do that for you completely risk-free and without any upfront cost. We do this on a gain share basis, so that means that you don't have to pay us anything upfront, and then we would only take a fee if we succeed, and that is typically a portion of the savings that we would make for you, obviously against a clear baseline of what we determine to be a saving, aligned with you and with your finance team, to make sure that we're all talking from the same page. So if that does sound interesting and you've got a category of spend that you just haven't had the chance to attack, and you'd like to have a chat with us around how we would do that on your behalf, then please get in touch with us after this webinar, and we would love to have a discussion with you and learn more about your business and your challenges and what we could potentially do. Bridget is your go-to person. Her contact details are there. She speaks English and Dutch and would be very happy to have a conversation. So with that said, let's jump across now. If anyone has a question, I don't see anything in the box, but if anyone does spontaneously have a question and wants to raise their hand or wants to quickly pop something into the Q&A, then please do. If there aren't any questions, then we can close out and wish you a pleasant morning or afternoon or evening as you go back to your day. But let's just double check to see if anyone has anything before we sign off.
Do you mind if I just make a final point, James, as we're waiting for any questions to come in?
No, not at all. Please jump in.
Okay. So, we've talked a lot about the different dynamics or different things to consider as you're engaging consulting firms. But I think, I want to be clear about like the importance of the decision, right? So as you're picking a firm, to me, it's kind of like picking a marriage partner in your personal life, right? It's the most important decision you're going to make in your professional life, especially if it's a big project, especially if it's something that's deterministic of where your career goes next within your organization. So again, make sure that you're taking the time to build trust with the different folks, and that you're going ahead with the relationship that gives you that most the most trust, the most feelings of trust in there, right? Because if you go ahead saying, this doesn't necessarily feel right, but I'll give them the benefit of the doubt, I've seen that go sour more than once, and I want to avoid you that pain.
No, that's a great point. Yeah, I think that's a very wise piece of advice to end this on. And I can see, yeah, we do have one question. Okay, so that's from Satish, and that is, what is the lead time for kickoff between using a big player and using a boutique? So I think by that he means, what would be the typical cycle time between the first engagements or the first discussions versus, contract being signed and the implementation coming in.
So I think, if I can take that one, James, if you don't
mind.
Yeah,
no, please do. Yeah.
So I think there's a couple factors to take into consideration here. So one of them is, if we're talking about really before the project and the sourcing and the contracting, then you'll most likely have, unless you adopt standard terms from a big consulting firm and the standard contracts that they have, you'll have a lot of back and forth in terms of the terms and conditions of the contracting. Whereas with a smaller firm, it might be, you'll still have that back and forth, but it could be done a bit quicker. So I think, I would give the edge to smaller firms on that piece. But then in terms of the actual onboarding to the project, once you've signed and you've decided on a start date, I think it really depends on the scope of the project, right? But the onboarding will be very similar from a big firm to a small firm. So you'll have, if it's a smaller project in the source to pay space and you're doing, say, a sourcing module implementation, then in 1 or 2 weeks, you're able to onboard everybody on the team and start the project, right? Making sure that you're aligning the RACI model as the responsibility and accountability model, just to eliminate the jargon I just used. And yeah, get the project started, get a kickoff going and get the work in place. It'll be the same thing, right? Whereas if it's a bigger project, and the more lead time you give to a consulting firm, the better, right? In the sense where, as James was mentioning, you might have folks that are already on the bench and available to start the project, whereas you might not, right? The best people are probably already on projects, right? So if you give the firm a couple months in that sourcing project to finish other projects and get their best people reserved for your project, then that's the way you're going to get the best team on your project and the best results.
That's a fantastic point. Actually, it might be counterintuitive, but it may be better to wait a bit longer so as they can get their A players onto your project rather than push them to implement faster.
Absolutely. And I always say, like, when you're hiring a consulting firm, you're not hiring a brand, or, you're not hiring a firm, you're hiring a collection of individuals that are the team that's delivering on your project. So to touch on number 5 that we didn't touch on during the presentation, references are great from a firm perspective, but you want to have the individual references of everybody that's going to be on your project team. That's going to carry a lot more weight in my eyes than, say, the firm references, because an IBM might have done projects in India and now we're doing something in Canada and we're using the India one as a reference, but nobody from the team that we're proposing has worked on that initial project, right? So make sure that you're checking references at an individual level.
That's a fantastic tip, Joel. So I hope that answers your question, Satish, and it was a great question. So thank you for that. So that concludes today's webinar. Thank you very much for joining us. It's a pleasure having you. Joel, thank you very much for being our guest panelist. It was awesome to dig in and pick your brain on this topic, because I know you have a lot more experience in this space than I do, coming from your background. So yeah, all the best, guys. We will speak to you again very soon the next time we run one of these, and enjoy the rest of your day. Cheers.
Thanks so much, James.